Hundreds of attacks were reported against Hindu individuals and property. Violence broke out when the local ISKCON chief, the Chinmaya Krishna Das, was charged with sedition and arrested. And Chinmaya was pushing for an 8-point agenda. Though an interim government was formed on August 8th, which is 3 days after Hasina fled, and a Nobel laureate, Muhammad Yunus, was appointed as chief advisor, the attacks against Hindus have continued unabated. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who, by the way, was the first global leader to recognize the new dispensation, the Yunus government, claims that the HBCUC, the minority group that I mentioned earlier, the numbers on the incidents that they gave of communal violence, he said, were vastly exaggerated. And on December 10th, the government reported that between August 4th and August 20th, 88 cases had been registered. Mind you, there were 2010 cases or incidents that the Hindu Council or the Minority Council had reported. He says that 88 cases have been registered. Nothing but the truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will deal with key issues of concern and bring you perspectives and clarity as to why these matter to you without holding back on the truth. Bangladesh is India's newest foreign policy headache. After a student uprising stunningly ousted Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina on August 5th, there has been a spate of attacks against the Hindu minority. There is also widespread anti-India sentiment on the streets of Dhaka and elsewhere. As concerning is the visible rise in Islamist radicalism that is threatening to engulf Bangladesh if the trend continues. So in this episode of Nothing But the Truth, we will take an in-depth look at what's happening inside Bangladesh, why India should worry, and what India needs to do. First, let's look at the continuing attack on the Hindu community over there. Now at 13.1 million population, the Hindus comprise of 7.95% of Bangladesh's total population of 165 million. Now, this makes them the largest minority in this Muslim-majority country. In the chaotic aftermath of Hasina fleeing Bangladesh, which we all saw on television, hundreds of attacks were reported against Hindu individuals and properties. According to the Hindu Buddhist Christian Unity Council, the HBCUC as it's called, which is a key advocacy group for minority rights in Bangladesh, there were 2010 such incidents that took place between August 4th and August 20th. Remember, Hasina flees on August 5th, and in that 2 weeks, over 2,000 incidents happened. These include 9 murders, 69 attacks on places of worship, and 4 incidents of violence against women. All these incidents are against the minority community, particularly the Hindus, which I said form a majority of the minority in Bangladesh. More recently, violence broke out when the local ISKCON chief, the Chinmaya Krishna Das, was charged with sedition and arrested. And Chinmaya was pushing for an 8-point agenda for minorities that included forming a fast-track tribunal to punish those committing atrocities against minorities, including Hindus. Though an interim government was formed on August 8th, which is 3 days after Hasina fled, and a Nobel laureate, Muhammad Yunus, was appointed as chief advisor, the attacks against Hindus have continued unabated. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who, by the way, was the first global leader to recognize the new dispensation, also told Yunus to ensure the safety and protection of Hindus and all other minority communities. Even US President-elect Donald Trump had tweeted on X after Christian schools were attacked in Dhaka, and this is the words he used: "I strongly condemn the barbaric violence against Hindus, Christians, and other minorities who are getting attacked and looted by mobs in Bangladesh, which remains a total state of chaos." He called it a total state of chaos. However, despite these tough words, the Yunus government claims that the HBCUC, the minority group that I mentioned earlier, the numbers on the incidents that they gave of communal violence, he said, were vastly exaggerated. But even he had to acknowledge some of the incidents listed, and on December 10th, the government reported that between August 4th and August 20th, 88 cases had been registered. Mind you, there were 2,010 cases or incidents that the Hindu Council or the Minority Council had reported. He says that 88 cases have been registered and 70 arrests were made for vandalism of Hindu temples and other acts of violence against minorities. Now, the interim government has also often argued that violence against minorities in Bangladesh seems more from what they call political vengeance than communal hatred. Now, this is an interesting point that they make, because there may be some truth in what the Yunus government's claim is, since these, and they say it's politically motivated, because many of the Hindus supported Hasina's Awami League party, as it was for them the most secular of the other main parties. But that still does not excuse Yunus and his new government, because they have done very little so far to address the systemic vulnerability of minorities who continue to bear the brunt of violent outbursts in Bangladesh. So while he claims that these are largely politically motivated and not religiously motivated, that evidence is not holding up. But the real point, I mean, it could hold up for some cases, but the real point is that the new government has to put an end to the violence and not just say it's politically motivated or religiously motivated. With the anti-India rhetoric in Bangladesh increasing, especially after Hasina was given shelter in India, there was a tendency of those running the country of blaming the Indian government and India for all their woes. Now, this had become serious, and to tamp down on the rising anti-India sentiments in Bangladesh, India's Foreign Secretary, Vikram Misri, visited Dhaka on December 9th and met Mohammad Yunus, apart from his counterpart in the Foreign Ministry. While Vikram Misri told his Bangladeshi interlocutors to ensure the safety of minorities, he emphasized that India looked forward to, and I'm quoting him, moving the relationship in a positive, forward-looking and constructive direction. Now, this was seen as the first big step, after all that has happened in the last 4 months, towards normalizing the relations between India and Bangladesh. So now let's deal with why relations with Bangladesh is so important to India. Take a look at the map and you'll see that situated at the mouth of the Bay of Bengal, Bangladesh straddles a crucial geographical space contiguous to India's sensitive northeastern states. It was India's solid support, if you look at history, to the Mukti Bahani, or the freedom fighters in the 1971 War of Independence, that helped Bangladesh break away from Pakistan. But since then, relations between the two countries, India and Bangladesh, have always been on a roller coaster. Whenever Sheikh Hasina was in power, India's relations was always on the upswing. Now, Sheikh Hasina is the daughter of the nation's founding father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who was assassinated in an army coup in August 1975. During Sheikh Hasina's 2 stints in power, first between 1996 and 2001, and then for 15 years, from 2009 onwards, up to her ouster in 2024, India's relations with Bangladesh were generally friendly. But those regimes that came before her, including the ones headed by Begum Khalida Zia of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, were seen as largely hostile towards India and many times undermined our core interests. Now, when Hasina won a 5th term in January 2024, that's early this year, after the Awami League, her party secured a landslide victory in the general election. That poll was widely criticized as having been rigged in her favor. Her main rival, Begum Khalida Zia, had boycotted the election in protest. Hasina, in the meanwhile, had barred the religion-based Bangladesh Jamaat-e-Islami party, her other main rival, from contesting elections from 2013 onwards. Now, Bangladeshi opposition parties blamed India for propping up Hasina despite the serious democratic and human rights violations by her government. They said that India put no guardrails and allowed her to have a free hand. When the student uprising, which was over the reservations of seats for freedom fighters, the descendants of freedom fighters really, a certain quota was being allocated to them. When this protest broke out, Sheikh Hasina targeted the BNP and the Jamaat for whipping up chaos in the country. She even banned the Jamaat for being an anti-secular, militant and terrorist organization, all in quotes. And despite Sheikh Hasina agreeing to resign the reservations, her government's brutal clampdown, really brutal clampdown on the agitators, the student agitators, left over 2,100 dead in police firing. And this resulted in a truly popular revolt against her, and Hasina, as we saw, was forced to flee to India using a helicopter and then an aircraft to land here in India. Now, among the first actions that the new interim government, led by Muhammad Yunus, took was to lift the ban against the Jamaat. Now, Jamaat has always been anti-India and advocated being closer to Pakistan and possibly never really condoned what had happened in terms of the breakup of Pakistan at that time. And ever since the Jamaat ban was lifted and the new interim government has taken charge, anti-Indian forces seem to have gained ground in Bangladesh, with many of the student leaders who led the agitation suspected to have links with radical Islamist organizations, including having links with the Jamaat. Now, to get a better sense of things, I spoke to Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, a former Indian High Commissioner of Bangladesh, a very wise and knowledgeable expert on Bangladesh, and his counsel is always valued. And he told me, and I'm quoting him, there seems to be a shift towards Islamist radicalism in Bangladesh. And went on to say it is certainly on the rise as religious intolerance, and for that, he says, is a true cause for worry for India. Now, India, he says, is also concerned that the new dispensation will push for closer ties with Pakistan and be inimical to our interest. He says that Pakistan could get a base to stoke trouble in our northeastern states, as they did earlier. There was a time when Pakistan used the East Pakistan as well as whenever there was a regime favorable to Pakistan, they used that as a base, Bangladesh as a base, to create trouble with a lot of our northeastern insurgents that was there. Now, experts see clear signs of the new regime's eagerness for close ties with Pakistan, and this is something that India is watching very closely. As evidence, many of these experts point out to the fact that a cargo vessel from Karachi docked at the Chittagong port recently, and this is the first time since the country's independence from Pakistan in 1971 that cargo ship was allowed to come in. Maybe there were incidents earlier, but clearly for a long time this had not happened. Now, visa constraints were also lifted for Pakistanis in certain categories. Now, these raised suspicions among the various other countries, particularly India, who was concerned by what was happening. And meanwhile, pressure was brought on Indian business investments, including that of the Adani Group. On November 19th, the Bangladesh Supreme Court ordered the government to form a committee to review the country's much debated contract with Adani Power after a petitioner alleged its terms were unfavorable to Bangladesh. The 25-year-old power purchase agreement was signed in 2017 for the Adani company to supply electricity from its 1,600 megawatt power plant in Jharkhand. Currently, the Bangladesh Power Development Board owes the Adani Group around 850 million rupees. That's equivalent to rupees 7,216 crores in terms of payment for the services that had been done, including electricity charges. Now, all these developments, their tilt or seeming tilt towards Pakistan or leniency towards them, they're putting action or taking action against Indian business interests. All these developments, apart from the fact that the attacks on the Hindus and the anti-Indian sentiment that is there, all these developments have evoked consternation among Indian foreign policy makers who maintain that India has high stakes in Bangladesh remaining stable, secular, and independent. Stable, secular, and independent. And that's very important, that India is very keen that Bangladesh follows this and is not, doesn't descend into chaos. So it is in India's interest to ensure this happens. Now, in the past decade and a half of Hasina's tenure, New Delhi was able to craft what is called a durable bilateral relationship that has really spanned a whole gamut of sectors. Now, India's trade with Bangladesh during this period grew almost threefold. Exports to Bangladesh, for instance, rose from $3.34 billion, that's about 28,000 crores, in 2010-11, that is the time of the early phase of Hasina's last tenure. It grew to almost $12 billion, that's rupees 1.02 lakh crore, in 2022-23, that's a year ago. Now, India has also extended a credit line of a line of credit of $7.8 billion, that's about 66,000 crores, for infrastructure projects in Bangladesh. So India has invested quite a lot in the past decade or so. Now, India is very, very concerned that other big powers have been elbowing into what it considers its own backyard. In 2016, for instance, during Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Dhaka, the two nations signed a flurry of agreements that would see Bangladesh receive $26 billion in investments for its Belt and Road Initiative projects and $14 billion for joint venture projects. Now, look at the difference. They're willing to invest $40 billion in all as compared to what India has done, which is about $8 billion of a line of credit. In fact, China has now become Bangladesh's largest trading partner, with the volume being around $25 billion as compared to around the $14 billion that India has. So China, this was India's backyard, but China has muscled in and really moved not only on the trade front, but also in defense. China has been employing submarine diplomacy, selling Bangladesh 2 attack submarines at really bargain prices in 2016. A year later, it signed a contract to construct a new submarine base on the country's southeastern coast for $1.2 billion, and ostensibly to service these submarines that they sold Bangladesh. And so in addition to maintaining these submarines, Chinese personnel would also train the Bangladesh Navy to ply them. And that shows the fact that they have invested so much on it indicates their interest in China and our worry that they are establishing indirectly a military base that they could use over there, and that's very dangerous for India. Now, concerned by China's inroads into Bangladesh, there was another country that was deeply bothered about it because they know that the Bay of Bengal is crucial to all strategic interests, and this was the United States of America, and they apparently began pressuring Dhaka to allow it to use a tiny island called the St. Martin's Island as a military base. Now, St. Martin's Island, if you look at the map, is situated just 8 kilometers from Myanmar, and experts believe that the US wanted to maintain it as a surveillance post for Chinese and Myanmar activities and for the strategic Malacca Straits. The US government has denied both its interest in St. Martin's Island or any deal for it. Let's make that clear. They have said, no, this is not true. However, on a parallel track, several US-based multinational oil and gas corporations, such as Chevron and ExxonMobil, have business intent in Bangladesh. Now, these companies considered participating in the bidding for prospecting and leasing of offshore oil and gas blocks offered by the government-owned oil company called Petro Bangla. These projects are worth several $billion, and this was said to be of great commercial interest, with sources close to Hasina claiming that the US was putting pressure on her to sign the deal when she was in power. She also mentioned in a press conference just before the elections actually happened in January that, she put it, as a white man was asking her to give up the St. Martin's Island. So she made it clear that there was such a move, but the US, of course, denied it. Now, Indian experts believe that the so-called deep state in the US may have had a hand in ousting Hasina. The military and commercial motivations were attractive enough, which we talked about, and Hasina made things worse for herself with her autocratic rule that had violated all tenets of democracy. Of course, the US denies all these charges. Now, Mohammed Yunus is seen to be close to the US as he had taken refuge after Hasina had charged him of embezzling funds from the Grameen Telecom. Remember, Mohammed Yunus won the Nobel Prize for his outstanding work in terms of rural banking, especially banking for the poor, and the Grameen Bank has become a legendary way of doing dispersing credit to the poor. So in the days and months ahead, India certainly needs to negotiate this minefield of competing interests, whether it's Pakistan, or China, and US for Bangladesh, and it has to do it very deftly to ensure that its relations with Bangladesh remain strong and its core interests protected, and of course the Hindu community there is not persecuted. The good thing is that right through this current crisis, both sides have wisely refrained from using punitive measures like disrupting trade and business relations just to spite or coerce the other. Now both sides need to engage regularly to sort out their differences so that the temperature cools down and the anti-India rhetoric is reduced, though not at the cost of the fact that if Hindus are being persecuted there, India needs to take tough a stance and push the Bangladesh government there to ensure protection of the Hindu minority as well as other minority communities over there. Now let's look at the new interim government led by Nobel laureate Yunus and how he is performing. By the way, Yunus brushes away charges that religious intolerance and extremism are growing in Bangladesh. In press interviews that he's given recently, the chief advisor, or Yunus, points to his cabinet, which he says is packed with human rights activists and pluralists, and he himself is known to be a liberal mind in terms of governance. But the tide of exuberance that greeted Yunus's assuming the reins of the interim government in August now seem to have considerably receded. There is growing concern among experts on whether the well-meaning Yunus is in charge or just a velvet glove for the iron fist of the radicalized student leaders and parties working with the Bangladesh army to launch sweeping constitutional and ideological changes in the country. Veena Sikri, another former Indian High Commissioner to Bangladesh, again highly respected, who I spoke to, remains highly critical of the new dispensation. And she told me, and I'm quoting her, the chief advisor, or Yunus, is unable to take decisions or unable to implement them. She went on to warn that it is now the Islamists who oversee this unconstitutional government, as the current constitution has no provision for such an interim government. As proof of the new regime's excesses, she points to how the Chief Justice of the Bangladesh Supreme Court and 5 other justices were forced to resign under duress soon after Hasina's ouster. The student leaders have not only gone ahead with their plans to restructure the country's judiciary, but are said to have been purging suspected Hasina loyalists from major government institutions. The other worries, with the police force being completely ineffective, the law and order situation remains precarious, and the Bangladesh army has to move in to protect many of the establishments that are there. Meanwhile, let's look at the Bangladesh economy, and that has taken a downward turn, especially after Hasina's departure. The mid-October projections by the World Bank indicated that GDP growth is likely to decelerate from 5.2% in the financial year 2024 to about 4.0% when financial year 2025 is completed. Quite a dip, almost a 1.2 percentage that's there. And remember, Bangladesh economy was doing very, very well for the past decade. It was seen as a high flyer economy, in fact, had higher GDP growths in many instances over India, and seemed to be getting out of the poverty trap that it had found itself soon after independence. But now, inflation is very high, particularly driven by high food and energy prices. It averages right now 9.5% and is expected to remain elevated right through. Unemployment or joblessness rates remain significantly high. Again, one of the reasons why the agitation broke out and the upsurge happened. And this is true particularly in urban areas. This is mainly because job creation in large industries, especially in the critical garment sector, which is the backbone of the Bangladesh economy, has stagnated. Now, the World Bank report, which I mentioned, which came out in October, also highlighted the need for urgent and bold economic reforms that Bangladesh has to do. But the interim government has been unable to provide a clear roadmap for revival as yet. So, Muhammad Yunus has a huge task of not only restoring the polity of his country, but also its shaky economy. The Nobel laureate has always claimed that the government's mandate is to implement reforms. The Jatiya Nagrik Committee, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, or translated into the National Citizens Committee, formed after the student uprising, along with the Anti-Discriminatory Students Movement, or ADSM as it's known, are also jointly advocating sweeping political and constitutional changes. Now, in September, Muhammad Yunus formed 6 commissions to reform 6 major sectors. These included the electoral system, the police, the judiciary, public administration, the constitution, and anti-corruption measures. All of these commissions are expected to submit their recommendations to Yunus by the end of the year. Meanwhile, 3 student leaders of the ADSM, or the student leaders who led the uprising, have been inducted as advisors to the interim government and given several portfolios. Key among these student leaders is Mahfuz Alam. He was the liaison committee coordinator of the ADSM, and he is now special assistant to Muhammad Yunus. At a Clinton Global Initiative function held in New York in September, Muhammad Yunus got Mahfuz Alam on stage and introduced him as, in quotes, the brains behind the meticulously designed protest that were planned and executed to oust Hasina. Indian sources allege that Alam has had links with the Jamaat student wing, the Islamic Chhatra Shibir, and also the banned extremist group Hizb ut-Tahrir. Veena Sikri sees Yunus's statement as validation of the student movement not being a spontaneous uprising, but backed by powerful domestic and international forces against Hasina's continuance in Bangladesh. However, Mahfuz Alam, in a Facebook post on September 26 that was reproduced by the Dhaka Tribune, denied any links with these extremist organizations, saying, and I'm quoting what he put in the Facebook post that he did, "I didn't and still don't subscribe to the Islam of Jamaat, or for that matter, Islamist or secularist ideologies." Meanwhile, mainstream political parties, especially the BNP, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, headed by Khalida Zia, are keen that elections are held soon and not a year later, as Yunus and the student leaders have indicated. The BNP is fast occupying the vacuum left by the Awami League after its disintegration since Hasina left, and has already taken over the trade unions and similar bodies at the local levels. BNP's acting chairperson, Tariq Rahman, the 59-year-old son of former President Zia-ur-Rahman and former Prime Minister Khalida Zia, is set to make a comeback to Dhaka sometime next month. He has been in exile for years in London. He had a slew of cases that were against him that had been put by the Hasina government. Now, these cases have been lifted by the new dispensation, and this has paved the way for his return. The BNP is pushing Muhammad Yunus to hold an election within the next 6 months, quoting May as the outer limit. The Jamaat, however, would like the polls to be held later because, I had mentioned, it had been banned for almost 13 years or 11 years, and it wants enough time to rebuild the party. However, both the BNP and the Jamaat will have to contend with the ambitions of the student leaders like Mahfuz Alam, who had led the entire uprising that happened, and they are keen on forming their own political grouping to contest the elections. So things will hot up in the next 4 or 5 months, but whichever party comes to power will determine what the new Bangladesh would look like, and India will have to find new ways to deal with Bangladesh. For more details, do read the latest issue of India Today magazine, which has an in-depth cover story. My colleague Arkamoy Datta Majumdar traveled to Dhaka and did an on-the-spot report, and we jointly wrote this week's cover story. Thank you for being with me in this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing But the Truth.